Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about this book, The Gardens of Glen Burnie, The History and Legends of a Virginia Legacy. So this is a bit more of a, kind of local interest thing. Our family lives in the Shenandoah Valley, not too far from Winchester, Virginia, and in Winchester there's a wonderful place called the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. And part of the museum complex is a historic house. It's called the Glen Burnie House. And they have beautiful, beautiful gardens that are part of the grounds that you can go there and visit. And it is one of our favorite local spots. We've had a membership there for a couple of years. And I absolutely love, the history is wonderful. They've got hiking and biking trails all around. The museum itself highlights a lot of the history and culture of the Shenandoah Valley, but the historic house is a beautiful house, and the gardens are absolutely incredible. They're probably my favorite gardens that I've ever visited, and I've had the chance to visit a number of places. So this is a book that was put together about 20 years ago. This came out in 2003, talking about the history and design of the gardens and into the house and the property and things like that. So, like I said, this is probably a bit more of a local interest thing. However, if you're a history buff or you're a gardening person, this would probably be an interesting book. You can get it at the museum. I don't know, it may be available online as well. But it's kind of a coffee table book, really beautiful, very well done, and I just wanted to share some thoughts on the book. So first off, this book, like I said, is walking you through the history of the Glen Burnie garden and house. So this is the Glen Burnie landscape, kind of the map here. It's really incredible. I'll give you kind of a quick little overview tour so you can have a sense of things. But you can park up here. You come in, and they've got a rose garden here, perennial garden, a grand alley here leading up to the house. They've got a family cemetery, a sunken courtyard with a pink pavilion there, marble flooring. It's beautiful inside there, fountains and everything. And then they have a formal vegetable garden, really beautiful area. This pleached alley is what you see here on the front. It's jasmine arches over the top there. You've got a nice greenhouse and carriage house. They have added, since this book was written, extensive spring garden kind of coming around the spring head here, along the town run and over by what was the original entrance back when this was someone's home. And then over here there's a beautiful Asian Japanese garden. There's trails here through these bamboo forest, a pagoda as well, and then back here into a beautiful water garden with a folly as well. And then it just opens up onto rolling open fields and things like that. So quite a lot packed into a fairly small space. This is just a few acres, and most of these gardens were developed within the last 50, 60 years around this historic property, this historic house. So what this book is trying to do is kind of do two things. First off, it wants to tell you the history of the house and the property, but also to tell the story of how that historic house and property was developed into the gardens that exist today as part of the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. So the first part of the book is called History Makes Its Mark. What they're trying to do in that section is to walk through, again, the history of the Glen Burnie house. It is a fascinating history because the house itself was first built in the 1700s. It is, I think it's the oldest building that was built in Winchester. If it's not the oldest, it's one of the oldest. Sort of some of the founding families of the town were the ones who built the current house. It was a working farm for many hundreds of years and was a hub of society not only in Winchester, but in Virginia as a whole. If you know anything about the history of colonial America, you'll know that Winchester was kind of the frontier in Virginia for quite a while. When George Washington was serving in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, he was stationed for a large part of that time in Winchester, Virginia. And if you fast forward a few decades to the American founding, a lot of the early presidents and statesmen either came out to the Glen Burnie house or knew the people there. So it has a very storied history that's woven in with not just the early history of the town of Winchester, but the early history of our country as a whole. It's only about 60 or 70 miles from Winchester to Washington, D.C. So it was a central, it was connected to a lot of the history that's going on there. And then, of course, when you get to the Civil War, the Shenandoah Valley in general and Winchester in particular were strategic points. And so the city changed hands many, many times between the North and the South. There were quite a few battles fought in and around Winchester. So it has a fascinating history as just a house that sort of sat at the crossroads of so much that went on in early American life. The French and Indian War, the Revolutionary era, the Civil War, on and on and on. And that house and property was passed down through the generations within that family until it was inherited by a man named Julian Glass. He inherited the property in the 20th century, and Julian Glass was the one who, along with his partner Lee Taylor, who developed the gardens there at Glen Burnie. Now, if you visit the Glen Burnie Gardens today and the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, they will make a big deal of pointing out that Lee Taylor and Julian Glass were in a relationship, and they make a huge deal about that, more than I wish that they did. But that is part of the history here, that these two men were in a relationship together. Obviously, it was in the 20th century, so it took a different form than probably how it would be trumpeted today. But it was really the creative genius of these two men that led to the gardens that we have today. Because when Julian Glass inherited the property, it was a historic house, but really a historic house on a farmland. There was not formal gardens of any sort there. If you walk there today, there's pathways and there's outbuildings and there's a lot of very intentional, landscaping that's been done. That all came out of Julian Glass and Lee Taylor's work. And specifically, Lee Taylor was sort of the guy, the muscle, the guy who actually went in and laid most of those paths and dug out the ponds and hauled in stuff. Julian Glass was very artistic, had a good eye for design and collecting, so he in his travels would find Roman columns or these ancient busts or these interesting grates and things, ironworks, and he would bring all those in, and then Lee Taylor and he would sort of design and put these things together. And they turned this historic farmhouse into this kind of elevated, aristocratic, fine home surrounded by these formal gardens. And over the decades, they developed the incredible network of gardens that you see here, in this map, and that you can see if you go visit the museum out in Winchester. And I would highly encourage you, if you live anywhere near the area or going to be passing through, stop off at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, visit the gardens. It is a real treat. One of the things I love about the Glen Burnie Gardens, and a lot of what the second part of the book does, is to kind of work through the different gardens, the Rose Garden or the Sunken Garden or the Water Garden or whatever it is, and they sort of tell you, hey, how did this come about? When was it built? What are some of the stories associated with it? And it's really fascinating to kind of get that, especially if you're interested in gardening. One of the things I love about it is that if you visit the gardens today, one of the things that I appreciate so much about it is it's a small garden in one sense. It's just a few acres, but it's very intensively developed and very well managed. I mean, I go there and there's never anything out of place. I don't see weeds. I don't see things that need deadheading. I don't see things that need pruning. They just do a great job, the workers and the volunteers there, of keeping it really looking tip-top shape. And I love as well the diversity within the garden, that you have formal kind of Western style gardens alongside Asian gardens, alongside very shaded gardens, sunny garden. It's just a great mix, perennials and annuals, exotics, natives. It's all kind of there and just very well laid out. And the pathway, the journey through the garden is such that you're always kind of stumbling on a new vantage point, a new site. So it's very inspiring from a garden design perspective. In fact, the greatest compliment I've ever received about The much smaller, less impressive gardens at our home on our 11th of an acre in a suburb in Virginia was when we had a family over from church, and one of their teen boys was in our back garden and kind of looking out at things, and he said, "Hey, Mom, this reminds me of those gardens over in Winchester at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley." And that was the greatest compliment I've ever received, because I am in many ways taking my inspiration from the Glen Burnie Gardens, probably more than anything else, from a design vantage point. So you always get great ideas from a garden design perspective visiting the Glen Burnie Gardens. But what's cool about being able to read the histories, you're not only getting beautiful pictures and photographs, and it gives you wonderful vantage points into the garden with these different photos and things, but you're getting the story of where these things came from, how the garden arrived in the form that it is today. And what you find, which is wonderful as a gardener, is to see that they made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of times where they did something and it didn't work. They talked about how at one point Lee Taylor really wanted to have an 18th century rose garden. So he wanted kind of species roses or heritage rose, heirloom rose varieties from the 18th century. He was going to bring them in, and he spent lots of money and time. He found this reputable dealer in California who raised these roses. He ordered hundreds of bushes, planted them in the ground. They bloomed beautifully for like 1 year, and then after that, they just didn't really bloom well at all. And he couldn't figure out what was wrong and had to rip them all out and plant something else in. If you've done gardening, that feels familiar, right? You're always bumping up against things that you thought would work this way and they work out a different way, and things you thought would be great and then they're terrible. But you also find surprises, things that you never kind of planned, but you find yourself falling into from a design perspective, and you get these happy surprises. So it's great to sort of look at a garden that feels like so perfect and realize they had to work towards that over many, many years. And what the author has done, the author, by the way, is a woman named Marge Lee, who has particularly worked with museums and historic houses and things to write books like this. So she has a really good voice. Sometimes books like this can be kind of dry, just random bits of information kind of thrown at you. She does a great job of kind of weaving together a story, focusing on the personalities and the people. She was able to interview Lee Taylor extensively before he passed away. For this book, she was able to talk to friends of Julian Glass and Lee Taylor, go through their diaries and receipts. There's a lot of kind of historical spade work that has been done in interviews to try and give you not just sort of the timeline of this property, but to give you a window into this unique period, because Julian Glass and Lee Taylor are developing these gardens for themselves, for their own pleasure. Neither of them had any training in horticulture or garden design. That's another inspiration for me. I have no training, but I'm trying to learn from others, and just to see what they were able to achieve is really inspiring. And they were doing that just to make a place of beauty. And they made the Glen Burnie house a hub of hospitality. They would entertain and they would host. They would have people over all the time for parties and for tea and just things like that. So it's a really cool vision to see the heart of these men to make something beautiful and then to share it with others. And as they were coming towards the end of their life, after Julian Glass had passed away and Lee Taylor was in decline, at some point in that process, I can't remember when exactly, but as they were looking towards the end of their life, they wanted to see this property carried on and preserved and continue to be shared, not just with their friends, but with others. And so that became part of the museum complex, and you can visit it today. And it's one of my favorite places in the world to go be and to visit. Beautiful gardens, rich history. And so if you are able to visit. If you're not able to visit, but your interest is piqued by any of this, maybe see if you can get a copy of this wonderful book, The Gardens of Glen Burnie, The History and Legends of a Virginia Legacy. It will allow you to, see some of the garden and to know some of the history and things there. And it's a fascinating read. Again, maybe of more local interest, but if you are interested in history, gardening, this is a book that's well worth picking up and leafing through.